Good afternoon. My name is Arne Jacobson, and I'm director of the Schatz Energy Research Center at Cal Poly Humboldt, and happy to welcome you all to this webinar session. We're hosting the webinar from Cal Poly Humboldt, which is located in the ancestral territory of the Wiyot people. Today's presentation highlights the importance of ensuring that the development of renewable energy sources, such as offshore wind, is done in a responsible manner that prioritizes the protection of seabirds and the marine ecosystems more broadly. With that in mind, I acknowledge and honor the leadership that tribal nations in the region have long played and continue to play with respect to environmental stewardship. In particular, I wanted to highlight the Wiyot tribe, which is an active natural resources department that's involved in multiple conservation and stewardship initiatives in the region. I'm pleased to announce today's webinar, which is focused on research that our team has helped to lead in collaboration with partners from Harvey Associates and with funding support from the California Energy Commission. The webinar is titled Seabirds in 3D, a framework for assessing collision vulnerability with floating offshore wind developments. Before we dive into the webinar, I wanted to first let you know that this is the first presentation of the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium's new webinar series. The Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium, or POWC, as we say for short, is a university-led partnership between the Schatz Energy Research Center at Cal Poly Humboldt, the Center for Coastal Marine Sciences at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and the Pacific Marine Energy Center at Oregon State University. We announced the consortium this past May, and we're now beginning to implement our first year work plan, with the webinar series being one element of that plan. As shown on the screen, our universities are embedded in the regions where offshore wind is being proposed. We believe that it's critical for the universities in the proposed host regions to be active partners in the science, policy, planning, and development that relates to the possibility of offshore wind. POWC will engage in research and innovation, education and workforce development, knowledge exchange, and tribal and community engagement activities related to the potential for offshore wind development along the U.S. West Coast. I'm happy to have some of my collaborators here with me. Sarah Henkel of Oregon State University and Ben Ruttenberg of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo are here with us. I'll invite each one of them to say just a few words about their respective teams and activities, starting with Sarah. So I'll pass it over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Arne. Yeah, so here at Oregon State University, we're really excited to be part of this really important consortium. For many years, Oregon State University has been one of the three partner institutions affiliated with the Pacific Marine Energy Center. And historically, the Pacific Marine Energy Center has been focused on what we would call water power technologies. So the energy that is being made by offshore renewables is being driven by the movement of water. So wave, tidal, river energy. And as many of you on the webinar may be aware, PMEC has been developing our PacWave wave energy test site. And so while we have been in the permitting process for that wave energy test site, we have historically stayed out of a lot of conversations about wind so that there's not confusion about what exactly the PacWave project will be and what could happen there. But now that that project is underway, we're really excited to start engaging with others that are researching offshore wind and the opportunities it may or may not have for the West Coast. And we think we can leverage a lot of the expertise that we've developed in PMEC over the last 16 years of its existence, and also some of the infrastructure that we're putting in for the PacWave, for example, cables, offers opportunity to answer questions related to similar components for offshore wind.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I'll now pass it over to Ben Ruttenberg of Cal Poly SLO.
Thanks, Arne, and thanks everyone for being here. It is an honor and a privilege to be part of this exciting consortium. I'm Ben Ruttenberg. I'm the director for the Cal Poly Center for Coastal Marine Sciences down here in San Luis Obispo. And our group has been involved in activities related to offshore wind for nearly a decade now. Much of our focus has been environmental in nature, thinking about things like resource characterization of wind and potential complementarity with other renewables, and also thinking a lot about fisheries, potential fishery interactions. And now a lot of our work is focused on trying to understand the monitoring needs for environmental to develop environmental guidance that will help ensure that we can, understand the effects, minimize and mitigate those. I'm really, really excited to be partnering with all these other institutions to move a lot of these projects forward. Also, a lot of socioeconomic activities happening down here in San Luis Obispo with workforce development and outreach and engagement. And then we have a very, very strong College of Engineering as well. So lots of opportunities for us to continue to engage. And I will show kind of behind me is our crown jewel, the Cal Poly pier down in Avila Beach, where we'd have the opportunity to test and deploy equipment directly from that pier. So again, really excited to be part of this group.
Thank you so much, Ben. And I think our team at Cal Poly Humboldt is also really excited about this consortium. We historically have lived by partnership, and it's really fantastic to have two great new partners in Oregon State and Cal Poly San Luis Obispo as we move forward with this work. And of course, also really excited about the partnership that's associated with this particular project that we're talking about today, which is work that we've done very closely with Harvey Associates. So today's session, as I'd mentioned, is Seabirds in 3D, a new framework for assessing collision vulnerability with floating offshore wind developments. Just a little bit of housekeeping as we proceed. One is that as we proceed through the webinar, you may have questions. Please enter those questions in the Q&A box, which should be available either at the top or bottom of your screen. And we have some time towards the end of the session that we'll focus on answering those questions. If you have a technical issue or some other issue that's not really a question related to the content of the work, you can also contact us using the chat feature. But for questions for the presenters or panelists, please use the chat box. Excuse me, not the chat box, the Q&A box. Our agenda for today, the first 8 items on this list of items for the agenda is essentially us presenting material associated with this work, and that'll be done through a mix of team members from the Schatz Energy Research Center and Harvey Associates. We will then have a guest panelist, Lisa Ballance of Oregon State University, who will provide some comments on the work, and then we'll have what we hope is ample time for questions and answers at the end of the session, which we expect to go up to about 3 p.m. Pacific time. Here I'm showing the partners and team members from the respective teams. The core teams for this work, or the main partners for this work, were the Schatz Energy Research Center and Harvey Associates, but we also had support from several others who are shown here, and funding support for the entire effort was from the California Energy Commission, and we're really thankful for that support. We were also supported in this work by an excellent technical advisory committee. I want to thank everybody who participated in that committee and their names and affiliations are indicated here on the screen. And with that, I'll just take a couple of minutes to talk through some key takeaways before passing it over to other colleagues. And I guess what's first shown here on the screen to the right is a graphic that shows seabird density in birds per square kilometer for all of the seabirds species that were included in the study. There were 44 species that were included. And the left side version of that, which in the offshore area shows colors more in the orange and yellowish part of the spectrum, which corresponds to seabird densities that are down in the area which I'm showing here. That's showing seabird densities for species at all heights. So those close to the ocean sea surface, as well as those that were more than 10 meters above the sea surface. The graphic on the right is essentially the same, except that it only shows seabirds that were flying, or the densities for seabirds above 10 meters. And the difference between them is that the densities above 10 meters were far lower than the densities when all of the seabirds were considered. And the reduction was more than a factor of 10. And so in terms of overall density, when you're thinking about the seabirds that are above 10 meters, it's a small fraction of all of the seabirds that were observed across the various data sets that we had to work with. And that's important from the perspective of thinking about which seabirds might be vulnerable to interacting with the blades of turbines, because it's only the birds that are at somewhat higher elevations that have the possibility of having those interactions. So that I just wanted to highlight as a key takeaway. We'll of course dig into that quite a bit more over the course of the webinar, and we'll show that for some individual species what the data look like. But I just wanted to start off with that high level key takeaway from that graph. I think another thing we wanted to highlight, just starting off at the beginning, is that the number of birds that are considered vulnerable to collision is much greater than the expected collision rates. In this analysis, we considered vulnerability as in terms of the density of birds that are present above 10 meters, and hence the 10-meter delineation that is referenced in the graph to the right. And when we talk about vulnerability, I think maybe it's useful to use an analogy, which is of a person who is crossing the street. So when you cross the street, you may be vulnerable to being hit by a vehicle, but you might do it many times in your life without being hit by a vehicle. So the possibility is there, but the expectation is that every time you cross may not result in a collision. In fact, it might be only a small fraction of the times that you would cross that would result in a collision. And we're not trying to make a quantitative comparison there, but just a qualitative one, which is seabird vulnerability means being up in that area where you might interact with the turbine blades, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's the same as a collision. Seabirds off the California coast and also the Oregon coast exhibit a diverse set of flight styles, and only some of the species are likely to fly above 10 meters, and some of the data that we'll present later indicate some of the differences there. The most prevalent seabirds above 10 meters, according to the data that we observed, are gulls, as they're abundant and have the propensity to fly above 10 meters in a range of different wind conditions. And then the seabird community, or the seabird community composition and density near to shore is very different from the density further from shore, both density and community composition. So those are some of the key findings related to seabirds and offshore wind. And then we also will be presenting an analysis of trade-offs and the relationship between wind generation and seabird vulnerability. And one of the key findings there was the multi-objective optimization analysis that we carried out indicated that areas offshore from Cape Mendocino to the north into Northern California and Southern Oregon are favorable both in terms of the amount of renewable energy generation that's possible and also having relatively low bird density compared to some other areas. So those are just some high-level takeaways. We'll dig into all of these a bit more as we proceed into the presentation. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Eli Wallach, to provide an overview of the 3D Seabird project. Over to you, Eli.
Thanks, Arne, for the intro and for giving some background on the presentation. Like you said, I'm going to get started with this project overview and kind of framework. Next slide, please. So the motivation for this project is that potential offshore wind development poses both displacement and collision risks to seabirds. Existing models of seabird activity focus only on density in 2D, modeling where seabirds occur with respect to latitude and longitude, but not where they occur in vertical space. Among seabird species, there's a wide range of flight patterns and behaviors. Additionally, these flight patterns for each species adapt to respond to different ocean conditions, particularly wind speeds. These complications make it challenging to estimate potential impacts using existing 2D distribution models and understanding how each seabird's flight pattern changes with wind speed, how this might cause them to interact with rotor-swept elevations will give a better sense of their vulnerability. Next slide, please. So faced with these challenges, this project set out to develop a three-dimensional seabird distribution model for California, evaluate the relative vulnerability of seabirds in the offshore wind development regions for different locations, and compare trade-offs between seabird vulnerability and power generation. And I'll just take a moment to highlight the figure on this slide, which shows a turbine with the rotor swept heights highlighted in red and the heights below the rotor shown in green. For turbines considered in this study, the bottom of the rotor is quite high at 30 meters above the sea surface or close to 100 feet, representing a large amount of airspace below the rotor blades. The goal of generating three-dimensional seabird density estimates is to understand to what extent seabirds may be present, not just in potential wind facility areas, but also at heights which put them at risk. Yes, thank you, Arne. To accomplish these goals, we put together this model framework. The ultimate goal, as mentioned on the last slide, is to trade off seabird vulnerability with power generation and identify which areas have both strong potential for renewable generation and low vulnerability to seabird. In this model framework, this final step takes the form of a multi-objective optimization, specifically a Pareto analysis that I will present later on in more detail. Feeding this optimization analysis are the two core models, the power generation model and the 3D seabird vulnerability model. And on the far left, we have all of our data inputs. Jumping into an overview of the seabird model. Slide, please. Thank you. Stephanie will be presenting this in much greater detail later on, but generally this model combines a flight height regression and 2D seabird density estimates to make the final 3D density estimates. Logistic regressions estimate the probability for different seabird species to fly over 10 meters above the sea based on flight group and wind speed. And an inverse distance weighted algorithm is used to generate density estimates in 2D. The inputs to this model are seabird observations, which include surveys from both ships and aircraft spanning the last 40 years. Another key input is long-term oceanographic covariates from remote sensing, and simulated wind speed data, specifically the NREL, California 20, and Northwest Pacific Wind Toolkit databases. Jumping over to the power generation model, I will cover this model in more detail later on, but this can generally be described as a simulations model, which estimates generation from a variety of wind farm scenarios and uses an eddy viscosity model to simulate wake losses caused by upwind turbines, slowing wind speeds for the remainder of the facility. Some of the key inputs to this model are the same NREL offshore wind speed data as the bird model, as well as turbine specifications, here based on the NREL 12 and 15 megawatt reference turbines, wind farm layouts which are generated using a placement algorithm, and the final input is the location of the wind farm. And with that, I will pass things over to Stephanie of HT Harvey to cover the Seabird modeling portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Eli. I think Sharon will take the first couple slides.
Yeah, great. Are you hearing me okay? Okay, great. Let's move to the first slide in this series. Yep, thank you very much. I'm really wanting to kind of give a high level introduction to the model because there's a lot in this model and Stephanie's going to go into a lot of detail about it. And I want to start with like describing a little bit more about sort of our thinking and at a high level, an introduction to how we kind of came up with the idea of doing this. But first, this graphic really is just to show you where the majority of offshore wind turbines are located in Europe in the box to the right. Now some in the Atlantic US East Coast, and then the box on the left, which is where California and Southern Oregon offshore wind leases are going to be. And the color scheme is such that the reddish color is shallower water and the bluer purple water is deep. And so the really striking thing immediately is that most existing offshore wind projects and facilities are in shallow water and with bottom mounted foundations. And a big difference is off California, it's deep very fast, and we're going to have different types of turbines. They'll be floating offshore wind turbines. And from a seabird perspective, this is really important because if you look at Europe, you look at the Atlantic East Coast, the shallow water, the bird species that are composed, communities of seabirds are quite different than the birds species that are off of California. Again, right now, most of the turbines are in waters that are 300 meters or less, quite a bit shallower than the turbines that are being proposed, the facilities off California, which will be 600 to 1,000 meters in depth. So we're really talking about different coastal ecosystems. And off California, we have the very productive California current system as well. So what happens is that a lot of birds that we'll see offshore in lease areas are going to be very different than what are in current offshore facilities in Europe and the Atlantic. And specifically, their birds have very distinctive flight styles, and many of them nest very far away. They're not nesting in California, but they're nesting in Hawaii, South Pacific, New Zealand, Australia, Chile. So we're going to have these birds are shearwaters, albatrosses, and petrels, for example. And this is really important because it's a different group of seabirds than you would find in the current places where facilities exist. So let's move to the next slide. And so this is a GIF that just kind of indicates how some of these birds that we're talking about fly. Now they fly these huge long distances, and that this is the type of flight is called dynamic soaring, which for these birds, they don't flap their wings very much, right? So it's a very energetically efficient way to fly super long distances to reach California current to feed. And this flight strategy basically is like using the wind, the energy of the wind, to surf in the sky. So they stay high up in the sky. They fly high up in the sky and cover these really long distances. And they have this big looping motion that they use to go high and then glide long distances back down closer to the water surface. So this repeats over and over and over, and this is dynamic soaring, and this is typical of that group of seabirds that we expect to see off California. Let's go to the next slide. So it's really a good advantage for these birds, these special groups of birds, energetically, because they They can go long distances and reach our high density food areas. But realize that many birds don't fly this high. They don't fly like this. And so especially a lot of the birds that are nesting in our area are lower and stay closer to the sea surface. But the birds that do dynamic soar and some that do fly quite high are in the potential, what we call the rotor swept zone, or the area where the rotating turbine blades are. So they're in that same airspace. Again, it's the vertical airspace that we're looking at. And so all the seabirds, again, don't fly that high, not all of them. So, and Arne said that very well earlier. The ones, though, that we're interested in are the ones that may be at a higher risk of interaction with turbine blades because they do fly at that height. So basically, we want to really tease apart sort of what's happening with seabirds, and we'll go to the next slide with respect to them colliding, so their potential for fatal collisions versus their vulnerability. So what we're looking at again is the classic ocean viewpoint is, bird surveys that have been done from vessels in particular, but from also aerial surveys don't really get us good information about flight height. So here's potentially a view that an observer might have on a vessel off the Pacific. And you would be looking out towards the horizon. We can look at the next slide and see seabirds and account for the seabirds. And there's very good protocols that exist for these seabird data. And that Stephanie will talk a little bit about that because that's the data set that we used, many data sets. But when we're trying to do seabird surveys from vessels or mainly from vessels, we're getting a sense of the seabird community that's out there, the species, and it's difficult to say very straightforward how high they're flying. So if you're looking out towards the horizon and looking at seabirds and the types of seabirds, the densities of seabirds, there's not just a really strong sense of exactly how many meters above the sea surface that they're flying. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So we do have data with seabird flight height that Stephanie will discuss, but there's a little bit of caveat to that. So let's go to the next slide. And now let's add a turbine or wind farm, a wind facility. And so again, if you look at the wind turbines, and this is a floating wind turbine, their blades are spinning in a certain airspace. And that's what we're trying to get a better understanding of, what birds are using that airspace and when and why. So let's go to the next slide again. Now here we have birds in the view out of our wind farm, our wind facility. And again, if they're flying within that area that's been highlighted, they are flying within what we call the rotor swept zone. Let's move to the next slide. I'll go through these really quickly. So these birds now have been dotted. The yellow dots are the birds that are flying at the height of the rotor swept zone. And the white dotted birds lower are below the rotor swept zone. And again, Arne mentioned this as well, that there really are differences by species, which ones do fly higher and which ones stay lower. But the ones that are dotted yellow are the ones we are considering vulnerable to collision. But we're still interested in all the community. So we definitely have looked at all the birds, 44 species. So let's go to the next slide though. So the birds that are transiting or moving through the area that's the same height as the rotor swept zone are what we call vulnerable to collision. So they're exposed to collision. And that's a very, very different thing than what is commonly done for wind projects, which is to develop a collision risk model. And that really, those models are pretty well established, and they're for estimating potential fatality of birds. So birds that get struck or collide with the turbine blades. So we're looking at their exposure potential and not the collision, because there's a ton of information that's needed to get at the collision and fatality estimates. And so for example, I'll run through those really quickly. Let's go to the next slide. You need to know physical aspects of the turbine. How fast are the blades spinning? How often are they spinning at those speeds? and the amount of airspace that's taken up by those turbines. So there's physical information you need to know about the turbine performance itself. And there's other information too, next slide, about the physical turbine itself, the blade length, the height above the sea surface that the hub is, where the blades are attached. All that defines sort of physical information about what we need to know about the turbine performance itself that inform collision risk. Let's move to the next slide then. There's other properties of the birds you have to know, and this includes information like their length, their wingspan, how fast are they flying, and what is their flight height and flight style. So these are physical properties of the birds themselves. And then the next slide, we'll also touch on interactions between them. So how, what is their flight direction relative to the wind and the turbine itself? All these factors matter in looking at the potential for collision, actual collision fatality to occur. So when collision risk models are done without any information about their behavior, we just assume that if they're flying the way we think they are, that their eyes are closed and they're going to have potential collision potential. But that's, again, not probably very realistic. We'll go to the next slide, finally, which is the thing that we really have the least amount of information on, which is, what is their sense that they can avoid the turbines? So it's a behavioral issue. And so are they able to perceive the wind farm or wind facilities at the macro scale, which is a distance, and avoid a whole wind facility of multiple turbines? Is it the mesoscale? So do they fly in through, say, a wind farm and avoid the turbines potentially? Or is it the micro scale where they realize that there's something coming at them within tens of meters or less of the turbine blades, and then they avoid it? So this behavioral piece is really critical, and this is what we probably have the least amount of information on. So with that, just to give background, I'm going to kick it back to Stephanie and let her talk more specifically about the model and all the work that went into it with our team. Thanks.
Yeah, and as you can tell, we always struggle presenting this particular project because it's very extensive. So we have extensive methods plus extensive results. So I'm just going to say at the outset, we're going to try to strike a balance between giving you enough details about the methods so you know what's happening, and so that you can understand the results, but also know that there's going to be all the final products available. So our primary goal was to apply this framework to a vast marine region capable of supporting future offshore wind facilities. And right now, a lot of discussions happening along the West Coast. So this is our study area, and the yellow prediction area, or the yellow area, is the observation area. That's the area for which we had observations that we used to generate our model. Our model predictions are a more narrow band of that, so it's the gray box. And that's focused to where we have the most data, and also the area where wind facilities can exist. That green line represents the water depth at which, beyond that, water is too deep to support current floating offshore wind technology. So our predictions are centered in this core area off of California, and in the California current system. This can be applied to other regions of the California current system. So anyway, this is our study area. Next slide. And just as we experience winter, spring, summer, and fall, seabirds off California go through 3 distinct oceanographic seasons. They experience upwelling, oceanic, and Davidson current. Each of these seasons are related to water and changes in circulation and productivity, and it has a lot of impact on how seabirds, different types of seabirds, are distributed in the California current. So for example, during upwelling, which is a long time of the year, that's when our local birds are breeding, and they are kind of tied to their colony. So they are distributed differently during that period than during winter, where they aren't tied to the colony. Another thing that happens during the oceanic period that's important is, and during upwelling, is birds that are breeding in the southern hemisphere are beginning to finish, and it's becoming winter down there. So they come up to where we're at, into the California current. So we get a lot of new birds happening in the upwelling and oceanic period that kind of go away for part of the year. Next slide, please. So I'm going to break this framework down. This is a part of a larger framework that Eli introduced, and it's multifaceted, so we're going to break it into components. The first component we had to do is relate flight heights to wind speed. So what these are probability curves that estimate the likelihood of seabirds flying at the height of rotor swept zones under varying wind speeds. So this graphic has wind speed on the x-axis and then probability of flying. And we'll get into this more, but basically we're just relating how birds fly, what heights, and how the wind is. Next slide. For component 2, we are predicting densities in 2D. This is a challenging task. Others have been doing this, and more recently, as we have computing power and methods, more and more predictions in 2 dimensions have been happening. We did this as well, and we took some novel approaches, like I said, with the seasonality. We used a spatial interpolation algorithm, and we use extensive data. So next, for component 3, once we have these 2D predictions, we need to convert these to 3 dimensions. And for that, first we generate a detailed windscape for each season and location to capture different wind conditions. Next slide. Next, we combine this wind data with the flight height probabilities from component 1 to estimate the likelihood of seabirds flying at rotor swept heights during different seasons. Next slide. Finally, we applied these probabilities to the 2-dimensional densities, creating a 3D model that shows seabird locations both horizontally and vertically. And this helps us understand where seabirds are most at risk from offshore wind by predicting their density overall and highlighting what it looks like at and above 10 meters. Next slide, please. So I want to orient you to the graphics. So when I show the actual data, you just know what you're looking at. These are the density prediction maps. This is a seasonal breakdown. So on the top is all overall predicted density, and the bottom is the predicted density above 10 meters. Next slide. And then for the annual predictions, which is what you'll mostly see, you're going to have the overall predictions on the left and the above 10 meters predictions on the right. And the colors will go from white to red, depending on the absence or presence and degree to which things are present. Next slide, please. And then our final, after we make all these predictions for different species, we aggregate these, and seasons, we aggregate these across species and season into a final aggregate density prediction, which feeds into the broader optimization analysis. And it offers a long-term multi-decadal perspective on the seabird community that is included in the framework. So next slide, we can delve deeper into the data that supports the 3D framework, the inputs. Next slide. For component 1, we relied on an extensive data set collected between 1976 and 2006. Next slide, please. The comprehensive database supporting our analysis in relation of seabird flight height in relation to wind speed reflects a tremendous effort. So this is a map of all the data. We had to isolate the California current portion of these data, which is circled and highlighted in red. And so we had to take a very extensive study of seabird flight height and wind speed and tailor this to the California current system so that it's representative of the birds and the flight groups that we have here. Next slide, please. So for component 2, the inputs were also seabird data, but different seabird data. We relied on 9 independent data sets collected between 1980 and 2016, which they weren't all collected the same, so they were strip transect, and we had to basically, what that means is standardize them all so that they could all come together and play together nicely and undergo this analysis. So that sounds kind of easy, but it took a lot of time. Next slide. This is just a visual representation of the survey efforts. So on the right, or on the left, is all the aerial surveys, and you can just see their extent offshore compared to the vessel surveys, where we have some very far-reaching offshore data. And then the right panel is the survey effort itself. So once you take all the stuff together, what was seen, where was looked at the most, and you can see Monterey Bay, San Francisco, but that strip that we're predicting, we have the most information for. So that's what that slide highlights. Next slide. Finally, for component 3, our input was the wind toolkit dataset that Eli had mentioned. I'm going to briefly cover it. Next slide. It's a 20-year average wind speed, and it's measured for our purposes at turbine hub height off of California at all those locations. And next slide. Basically, what we do for each location is generate a histogram of all the wind speeds that have been experienced based on 15-minute binning across that 20-year period, and that goes into the model. Next slide. So that's one of the main points to make about the wind speed is we have extensive wind data. We have seabirds observed from 0 to 30 meters per second wind conditions, and that's the same that turbines operate. And also, another thing that's important to note is because of what Sharon said, we weren't thinking about 30 meters as seabird biologists. We were thinking about 10 as a height we can easily say birds are above or below. So all our predictions are above or below 10 meters, but that doesn't mean it doesn't represent above 30 meters. And you'll see some of the graphics, but some of the birds are predicted virtually to never go above 10 meters. So that means those birds also won't go to 30 meters. So that's what this graphic kind of highlights, is this green zone of where the birds are definitely out of the rotor swept zone, this red zone or yellow zone in our model where we kind of include birds that are in that area, but because birds that are likely there are going to go up higher. And then we also have the birds that are known to be at extreme heights. So next slide, please. This figure illustrates the 18 distinct seabird flight groups. So this is all 44 seabird types included in the study. I wanted to show this just to get a breath of it. Some of these things, like we have loons, grebes, and ducks. Grebes represents a lot of species, actually, more than one, but they're similar enough. Some species we weren't able to separate. So anyway, you can see the 44 types, and most of them to species, and you can see the different body shapes, and this influences how they can move through the environment. So birds that are shaped one way can move a certain way through the environment, whereas other birds have to work harder. And this is relevant to some of our results. Next slide. So this is the flight height and wind speed regressions. And so for each of the 18 flight groups off of California, it shows at different wind speeds, what's the probability of being above 10 meters. And I want to simplify this community even further from 18 flight groups to 3 kind of patterns of responding to wind. Next slide, please. There's the flight groups that stay below 10 meters regardless of wind speed. And this is about a third of the types of flight groups that we are looking at in the California current system. So you can see these birds are going to be staying low regardless of wind speed and likely remaining below 10 meters. Next slide, please. Actually, go back. Sorry, I wanted to just point out and make sure you saw the flight groups. So, you know, we have fulmars, dynamic, or different things like storm petrels, phalaropes, cormorants, and alcids. Sorry about that. So next slide. Then we have the birds. There's a handful of flight groups, the skuas and the gulls, that tend to fly at various heights, including including heights that are above meters, regardless of the wind speed. So 0 meters per second, 30 meters per second, 25 to 50% of the birds might be up at and above 10 meters. Next slide, please. Finally, we have groups with more extreme responses to wind. So when I say extreme, I mean like a 10% change in the probability or greater. So, and that could be increasing or decreasing. So like with terns, as wind speeds increase, the probability of them being at risk height is decreasing. Whereas with something like a larger diving shearwater, the pattern's the opposite. So anyways, to the next slide. So those patterns all together and the composition of all the birds all together and the wind come to, we arrive at this map, at this prediction. This represents the whole seabird community that was modeled. So some of the key takeaways, when you just look at this map, like I said, the left panel's all the birds that are predicted, and the right panel is just above 10 meters, and you can see it's a dramatic reduction in the number of birds. I'm not going to get into the absolute numbers just because that's a lot of detail, but you can see reds and oranges and then blues and purples. And it's an 8%, about 8% of the seabirds are flying above 10 meters. That's what's predicted. So the highest densities are near the coast. You can see the reds around Monterey Bay, and that pattern's true above 10 meters as well. And yeah. Next slide, please. Another way of looking at the community, not just density, is compositionally. This is kind of a complicated graphic, so next slide, please. If we just focus on this portion of it, that's the overall community, and you can just kind of use your eyes and glance and see it's 70% alcids, shearwaters, and gulls, and then the remainder is other. Next slide, please. And then, so this next area is above 10 meters, and you can see the community shifts a bit. Instead of being kind of equally gulls, alcids, shearwaters, now it's a lot more gulls and a lot of shearwaters and not a lot of alcids. And these things are changing because of how these different types of birds fly. Next slide, please. So for the remainder of this presentation, we're going to focus on, for the 3D seabird portion, we're going to focus on, as a walkthrough, 3 types of birds, the most present birds, and also alcids because they include our threatened and endangered birds. So next slide, please. This is just a range map of sooty shearwater, and you can see they're throughout the ocean. If you go to the next slide, you can see these are all the surveys of all the observations of all birds on Earth that are in this database. And you could see if you went back and forth between those that the sooty shearwater is a good component of all the birds that are out there at sea and even in California. So, and this bird has an extreme response to wind. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. This is a picture of them actually from September off of Capitola in Central California, just so you get a sense of how dense these birds can be. They are accounting for a good percent of all the birds in the California current at certain times of year. Next slide, please. This is our predictions. And again, you can see the same patterns hold. This bird is going to be way more present and dense below 10 meters compared to above, but that response to wind is going to say that certain wind conditions, that there'll be more birds available at the risk height versus less at slower wind speeds. So it'll change a bit. Next slide, please. So this is a seasonal breakdown. I just wanted to show this because this is one of the species that isn't here for part of the year. So you can see it's present upwelling and oceanic and then gone during Davidson. And it's most present, for us, we're going to focus on upwelling to kind of illustrate how we calculate what percent of birds are above 10 meters. So if we could go to the next slide. Yeah, and the next slide. So this is an example of sooty shearwater in the Humboldt wind energy area in an upwelling season. And it's visually showing you how wind speeds are used to predict seabird densities above 10 meters. So here the wind speeds are represented by color and column width. And so wider columns equal more days without wind. And what all you got to really know is fast wind speeds of 18 are really rare. And that with the average wind speed, the average birds predicted to be above 10 meters is about 0.48 birds per kilometer squared. Next slide, please. If we look at this in terms of percent of the population, that's about 7 or 8% of sooty shearwaters above. And then if we could go to the next slide. That doesn't mean we're using the average. We're including all these different estimates with the different wind speeds. So we're even including the fact that we do have sometimes winds that are 30 meters per second. And at those points, up to 80% of the population could be at the height. So the model does include all that for all the species that are modeled. And I just wanted to highlight that. Yeah, so next slide, please. Not just saying, yeah, the 80%, thank you. So the gulls are the most abundant type of seabird above 10 meters predicted from our model. It's a group of them, so it's not one species, it's 9. I just wanted to show you, some of them are wide ranging, some are not, some are local, very local. Western gulls are West Coast specific. So yeah, there's a lot of differences in the gulls, but they do fly similarly. Next slide, please. Which is why we grouped them together. And the predictions suggest a similar pattern. They're more dense near the coast, and they are going to be less dense at risk height. But they're important and predicted to be a big component of the community above 10 meters. So the next slide. We focused on murrelets. We wanted to focus on threatened and endangered species, but they're rare, so they're hard to model. So these are the 2 that were included. These 2 taxa, marble murrelet, and then a group, Scripses, Guadalupe and Creveriae, due to taxonomic reasons. Anyways, but the point being is these birds their flight height curve suggests they aren't going to get to a certain above 10 meters. And then if you could go to the next slide, you can see that when you look at the predictions above 10 meters, it's very low and negligible offshore. This is a species that doesn't really go offshore. So although there's a small potential. Anyways, with that, I will pass this to Eli for the power generation.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, for going over those considerations in 3D seabird modeling. Switching gears, I'm going to talk about the power generation model in more detail and then present some results from this model, starting on which locations are considered. Slide, please. We have 8 in total with a wide range of descriptions. Some Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, wind energy areas were considered, namely the Humboldt and the updated Morro Bay 376 wind energy areas. One former BOEM wind energy area was considered in Diablo Canyon, and 2 notional call areas were considered. A Crescent City call area imagined by the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust, and a Cape Mendocino call area imagined by us at the Schatz Center. We also considered the proposed wind demonstration sites in state waters off of Vandenberg, the Cademo site. And we also looked at 2 seabird hotspots as a way to bookend this analysis. These are included to show the range of seabird densities, and we wouldn't expect any type of offshore wind power facilities or development in these areas. And those areas are Monterey Canyon System and Delgado Canyon. For each of these locations, we looked at scenarios for 600 megawatt farms and full build-outs for both 12 and 15 megawatt turbines. A key part of this analysis was determining the full build-out capacity for these facilities. For this, a placement algorithm was developed which generates turbine placements considering minimum spacing between turbines, as well as mooring anchor positions with respect to water depth at the turbine locations. And then the final analysis that we did using this power generation model was a full coast analysis, which simulates a single 12 megawatt turbine in each of the 2 by 2 kilometer grid cells native to the NREL wind speed data. Which brings us to some power generation results. Slide, please. These were generated based on the NREL 12 and 15 megawatt reference turbine power curves, which relate wind speed to power output for these turbines. Additionally, we have included some loss factors based on the experiences of terrestrial wind power facilities, including both losses in efficiency and downtime losses. An eddy viscosity model is used to estimate wake losses for each specific layout and location. On the left, we have capacity factor for each reference area. This capacity factor reports the percentage of the maximum technically feasible generation that can be achieved by these turbines. If there were always strong winds and turbines never needed service, they would have a capacity factor of 100%. In reality, these winds are not always available. So for reference, land-based wind power facilities achieve about 36% capacity factor on average. We can see from this graphic that the simulated wind farms perform from about 40 to 55% capacity factors, with seabird hotspots showing the worst wind resources. These are closest to shore of all of the reference areas. Most areas perform quite similarly, with Cape Mendocino having the greatest capacity factor. And then I'll just point out the error bars on these figures represent uncertainty in turbine availability rates, or how much downtime these turbines may have due to repair and servicing. This graphic also shows that the 12 and 15 megawatt turbines perform very similarly, so much so that for the rest of the presentation, we will only focus on the 12 megawatt turbines. On the right, we have a graphic that reports total annual generation from each scenario. This figure tells an important story that ultimately total power generation, and bird vulnerability for that matter, is largely a function of how many turbines are placed. You can see just how much more power could be extracted from a large call area such as Diablo Canyon when compared to a smaller call area such as Humboldt. Next slide, please. This slide looks at the results from our full coast analysis. Here we look at potential generation from a single 12 megawatt turbine for each of the grid cells in the study area. You might note that the colored area is smaller than the study area presented in the Seabird results. This is due to the limitations of water depth that these turbines might be placed in. Following NREL, we assume that 1,300 meters is the maximum depth for this technology, and we do not show power generation estimates beyond this isobath. Another interesting note is that when comparing these results to full facility estimates, capacity factors are a bit higher, as in this scenario, we envision no other turbines to cause wake losses. These are each, as it says, a single turbine. We can see that the highest generation is available just off of Cape Mendocino and also into the Oregon-California border. Generally, we see that wind resources worse near shore and better offshore. Now that we've talked about both the Seabird and power generation portions, we can start to talk about some of these trade-offs between these two models. Slide, please. And one more. So I will start with a conceptual example of Pareto analysis. This doesn't show real results, but rather just conceptual values. So we chose to use this Pareto analysis to trade off these two metrics, as it's commonly used for multi-objective decision making. It allows for simple graphical analysis of marginal benefits between two alternatives and does not require the weighting of objectives. In Pareto analysis, it's typical to maximize or minimize both objectives. For this effort, we chose to minimize both inverse energy generation and seabird density above 10 meters. By minimizing the inverse of power generation, we are effectively maximizing power generation, but the values on the graphic will be shown in decreasing order as a result. Jumping over to some interpretation of this conceptual example, we can see the Pareto front drawn in black, and each alternative is drawn with a blue dot. These alternatives could represent either a wind farm or a single turbine scenario. Alternatives to the left have the lowest seabird density above 10 meters, while alternatives towards the bottom have the highest power generation potential. Alternatives which fall along the Pareto front are frequently referred to as Pareto efficient and have no other alternative which outperforms them in both metrics simultaneously. For example, we can see the point labeled with an A has the lowest seabird density of all of these conceptual alternatives and therefore falls on the Pareto front. If only seabird density was considered, this is the alternative that would be selected. As we move down to point B, we can see that this point has more power generation than point A, but also has higher seabird density, representing a compromise. Jumping all the way to point C, we can notice this point falls on the Pareto front, as no other point has better power generation. This is the alternative that would be selected if only power generation were considered. Point D represents an alternative that looks less appealing, as the unlabeled point on the Pareto front offers an improvement in both metrics, decreasing vulnerability to seabirds and increasing power generation. It's worth noting that other objectives are likely at play in this analysis. If some alternatives which fall along the Pareto front are not attractive for a reason external to this analysis, a point like D, which is near the front, could represent the best option. Some considerations that are important for siting a wind farm but are external to this analysis are things like marine mammal habitat, energy transmission considerations, and conflict with other sea spaces. And with that, we can jump into looking at some real Pareto results. We will start with the all modeled bird species and the single turbine scenario. Slide, thank you. This analysis looks at the entire study area in feasible water depths, and each point on the Pareto graphic considers a single turbine in each of the 5x5 mile grid cells native to the 3D seabird model. These points are colored with respect to how near the Pareto front they fall, with an alternative that lie on the front colored in black, those that lie near the front colored in purple, and those that lie far from the front colored in red. It is important to recognize that alternatives which are Pareto efficient may land on the front due to high generation, low bird density, or a compromise of the two. The map graphic serves to show how this Pareto analysis plays out spatially in the study area. This Pareto analysis shows that the north of the study area is most attractive. Much of the full range of generation potential are available at near minimal bird densities, indicating that these two objectives are not primarily in conflict, particularly in the north. We can see that areas off of Cape Mendocino fall on the Pareto front. This will be true for other seabird species that we look at, as these are on the front for having the highest generation potential in the study area. And then some areas in the far north of the study area are on the front due to having the absolute lowest seabird density. The next slide shows the same Pareto graphic with the same analysis for a different species. Here we are looking at the high-flying species of sooty shearwater. As Stephanie explained, these species are of greater concern due to their dynamic soaring flight style. And although these birds are very likely to fly into rotor-swept elevations during high wind speeds, they're estimated to fly lower at average wind speeds, leading to low density estimates above 10 meters on average, less than 7 birds per square kilometer. Compared to many other species, these birds show more tendency to fly further offshore, leading to some relatively dense population estimates predicted far from the coast, particularly in the south of the study area where waters are warmer. Moving on to look at another species group in gulls. These are another high-flying species, with gulls making up much of the total vulnerability above 10 meters. This graphic shows that gulls have many of the same trends that were observed in the all birds map, which is unsurprising as gulls make up about half of the birds above 10 meters. Gulls tend to be closer to shore and concentrated in warmer waters in the southern extent of the study area, similar to what we saw with the sooty shearwater. Similar to the all species map, we see the lowest densities predicted in the north of the study area. And the next slide shows a Pareto analysis result for our federally and state listed species. In this case, all of these species are murrelets. We can see some interesting trends in this plot. We see some areas to the south are marked as Pareto optimal, as well as some offshore areas near San Francisco Bay that were not present for some of the other species groups. We can also see that the magnitude of bird density estimates are very low, at below 1,000th of a bird per square kilometer, or about 1 bird in 1,000 square kilometers. This is in part due to the scarce nature of these protected murrelets, but also reflects the fact that these murrelets are not likely to fly above 10 meters in any wind condition. Another interesting note about this particular graphic is the sharpness of the elbow in the Pareto curves in solution space, this right side panel. This shows that these two variables are not in direct conflict, as solutions that are near to optimal in both variables exist simultaneously in this set. If this was not the case, the Pareto front would have a more rounded shape and not approach as close to the origin of the graphic. Jumping to the next slide, we are looking at a zoom in of the Pareto front. This only includes the nearest 20% of cells based on distance to the front. And this result is jumping back to look at our aggregate of all birds. The top 20% of alternatives based on the Pareto front are shown on this graphic, with all others shown as gray on the map. By grouping these alternatives, we can see what decisions might lead to selecting each. The groupings used include a strong preference to low bird vulnerability, a preference to low bird vulnerability, more balanced objective weighting, a preference to power generation, and a strong preference to power generation. This graphic also serves to better understand how the shape of the Pareto curve might influence decision making. We can see here this curve has almost a right angle. This means that as you start at balanced objectives groups weight, as you start at the balanced objective weights group and move left towards alternatives which favor reducing bird vulnerability, a large amount of power generation is lost without reducing bird vulnerability much. Similarly, starting from the balanced objectives weight group and moving to alternatives which favor power generation is not dramatically improved, but bird density does go up significantly. So this shape of Pareto curve would encourage choosing a solution near the elbow, shown in yellow here. In addition to this analysis, which considers a single turbine in each cell across the entire coast, we also did some Pareto analysis of the wind farm scenarios presented earlier. Next slide, please. So this graphic shows the results of the Pareto analysis, which maximizes per turbine generation and minimizes average bird density at turbine locations. These results are based on the 600 megawatt farm scenarios and are normalized to a per turbine basis considering vulnerability of all modeled species. Again, this is the aggregate of all species. This result shows that Cape Mendocino and Crescent City are Pareto optimal, with Humboldt not far behind. We can see that nearshore locations performed poorly, having both relatively low power generation and high vulnerability to birds. However, these results do not account for different reference areas having potential different build-out levels or different number of turbines that can fit. An important consideration is lost in this analysis. That is, all else equal, a facility with more turbines likely poses a greater risk to birds. Which brings us to the next slide, where we consider this metric another way, assessing the wind facility scenarios in terms of full farm metrics. Here we are looking at full build-out scenarios, considering these additive facility metrics. These metrics are the sum of vulnerability at each turbine location and the sum of generation for each turbine, leading to vulnerability units of Seabird turbines per square kilometer, and then terawatt hours for generation. This leads to the simple conclusion that smaller facilities pose less vulnerability to seabirds, but also less benefit in the form of renewable generation. The very small facilities, such as Vandenberg and some of the seabird hotspots, have been excluded from this graphic as a result, as they generate so much less power they would skew the scale. We can see that with the exception of Morro Bay, each of these locations fall along the Pareto front, offering a different balance of generation and vulnerability to seabirds. This additive metric is not without its flaws, though, as it considers each additional turbine added to the facility as having the same impact as an existing turbine. This simple additive metric then fails to account for potential avoidance and attractance behaviors of seabirds that Sharon spoke about earlier in the presentation. We could imagine birds being more evasive of a larger farm, as it would have a larger visual impact, as well as more downstream turbulence compared to a smaller farm. To fully understand the trade-offs between these sites, a more complex risk model is needed which can accurately account for these avoidance and attractance behaviors of birds, behaviors that are yet to be observed for some of the species considered in this study. Which brings us to the next portion of the presentation, where Stephanie will cover future research efforts and priorities.
Here, I can do that. So this future research priorities is about ongoing work that's happening off the coast of California, and is current. So if you want to go to the next slide. We got some nice imagery of some things that have been going on. This is actually from 2021. We had a thermal tracking device out at sea in the Humboldt wind energy area. And it's a novel device that can position birds in terms of their height in addition to their distance, and is fairly accurate out to 500 meters. So this is the buoy, and it sat out there for a year tracking birds as long as it could. The buoy had some issues. But in general, there's a close-up of it. It's 2 thermal cameras, and the nature of the stereo vision helps reduce different types of errors in tracking. Some of the interesting things on land, we have some images of bats, and we can tell that bats look different than birds. So we have a bat and a bird, and that's good news. So we'll be able to get big groups of organisms separated. And then it kind of just shows you in the Humboldt wind energy area, for the birds that were present, there were no bats observed that we are aware of. You can see how the bird detections overlap with the rotor swept zone heights. So this is the first device that can see above a certain height. Human eyes are limited to some degree and can't necessarily see this whole rotor swept zone. So the thermal tracker is a device that can actually see the whole extent of the rotor swept zone and understand what's going on. And the other thing about it, because it senses heat, is it can see things throughout periods when humans never have been able to see. So times of day, not just times of day, but throughout the evening when it's dark and we've not really seen before. So we've learned a lot with this device, including how birds distribute in the airspace. The center bottom figure is important. That's the empirical data on how birds are distributed in the airspace. And you can see the first bin is 0 to 10 meters, and most of the community is in that bin. The dashed line, the first dashed line is 30 meters, and you can see a lot of the bird community is staying below 30 meters. And it's just a fraction of the community that's going to be in this rotor swept zone, and that's the empirical data we have from the wind energy area off of Humboldt at this point. And then the last panel was just to say birds definitely are moving around at times of night when it is dark and even when the moon is not present. So there are times when birds are moving around when it is going to be very dark out there, and we know that. So it's just we're learning a lot about a time that we've never been able to see before. And then next slide, please. Another thing that we're doing, as Sharon mentioned, we're really, for collision risk modeling, hoping to get much better at calculating avoidance rates for each species that would need that. Not every species needs necessarily a collision risk model, but for the ones that do, having a way to measure avoidance at various scales as birds are far away from the wind turbine and the facility itself, and as they approach, and as they're in it, and as they get to the blades. All of these different scales of understanding avoidance of birds is going to help us predict better what we expect might collide with these structures in the future. So we have been working on this funding with all these sensors to bring them together and find out all that information. So with that, I will pass it back for conclusions.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Sharon and Eli. I think just coming back to some of the key takeaways that we started with, I won't spend that much time on this because we've already talked through it in great detail, but some of the key takeaways, the number of birds considered vulnerable to collision is much greater than the expected collision rates. And in this analysis, as we talked about, vulnerability is measured in density of birds present above 10 meters, which is perhaps a somewhat conservative metric, given that we expect the bottom end of the turbine blades to be maybe closer to 30 meters above the sea surface. Second is that seabirds along the Californian and Southern Oregon coasts exhibit diverse flight styles, and only some of them are likely to fly above 10 meters. The most prevalent birds above 10 meters are gulls, and the seabird community composition and density differ in the nearshore versus offshore waters. And then in the analysis of trade-offs, the multi-objective optimization suggested that areas from Cape Mendocino to the north into Northern California and Southern Oregon would be favorable both from a renewable energy generation perspective and having relatively low bird density. So as we close out, we will move into a panelist discussion. I will actually stop sharing screen and as we move into this portion, and we'll welcome Lisa Ballance of Oregon State University as a panelist. And maybe Lisa, if you could introduce yourself briefly and provide a few introductory and remarks and just reactions to the content of the webinar.
Sure, thank you. Just doing a sound check that you have me loud and clear. Great. Yeah, I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks for the invitation to speak briefly as a panelist. My name is Lisa Ballance, and I'm a professor of fisheries, wildlife, and conservation sciences at Oregon State University. I'm also the director of the Marine Mammal Institute. Despite that title, I'm a card-carrying seabird biologist and have been one since 1988, when I began my PhD studies on seabirds at sea. And since that time, 1988 to actually just this past April, I've been conducting at-sea surveys for marine mammals and seabirds throughout the entire Eastern Pacific, mostly in the California Current and an area that is south of that, the Eastern Tropical Pacific. So in fact, a lot of the data that we collected, myself and my team, especially when I was with NOAA during a 35-year period, were used in the analysis that was presented today. I'm very happy about that. I will say another thing about my own background. Recently, I've been with Oregon State University for 5 years as a professor and director of the Marine Mammal Institute here. And a couple of years ago, I obtained funding from the Department of Energy and Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to conduct some research off of the entire Oregon coast and the part of Northern California, place we just refer to as the Northern California Current. It's baseline research to assess distribution, abundance, and density patterns of marine mammals and seabirds in that area from the coast out to 3,000 meters depth in 4 seasons. So ultimately, we are hoping to put together 2-dimensional predictive density models for every species out there. We just finished the 2nd year of our field season and are now entering 2 years of analytical work, and the relevance of that work to this particular webinar pertains directly to offshore wind energy and the proposed offshore wind energy areas in our study area, Northern California and Southern Oregon, because the spatially explicit density maps that we will provide as part of this project will be used by decision makers in the context of placement of offshore wind energy platforms, should they decide to be to move forward. So with that introduction briefly, I want to just make a couple of comments about the presentation today. And I'll start by saying that the analytical piece associated with the Seabirds is an extension of a very powerful analytical tool that is quite commonly used in the marine realm and in marine spatial planning. It's this use of what we call species distribution models to take what you know about species occurrence, link it with environmental factors, and predict density even in areas that you haven't been able to sample. It's a powerful tool because it allows you to predict those densities and overlap those densities with anthropogenic impacts, and therefore make more informed decisions about mitigating those impacts. This presentation today for the Seabirds extends that model and that approach to a three-dimensional framework, which is absolutely critical to Seabirds. It's a huge improvement for assessing their vulnerability to strikes from these offshore wind platforms. I also think the trade-offs analysis is really particularly informative. It's informative for decision makers of all kinds, industry, managers, others. So that's a really nice, very strong piece of this. And then finally, my overarching comments, I'm going to end by saying I am part of the project team. So perhaps it's not all that surprising that I think this is a really fine piece of work. I think if I might, Arne, I do have 3 general high-level thoughts about challenges, limitations, and opportunities of this approach. And I'll just summarize those briefly here. Again, a reminder that I'm a seabird biologist, so with no surprise, all of my thoughts pertaining to that pertain to seabirds. And so the first 2 high-level thoughts that I have were hit pretty strongly in the presentation and in this work, but they're important. So although they've already been said, I want to reiterate them here. The first one is that wind speed is a critical factor in assessing vulnerability to seabirds, and that's because wind speed affects flight patterns and flight height. And what that means explicitly is that for any given species, their vulnerability to strikes will vary in space and time as wind strength varies. Now, the model explicitly takes all of that into account, but just thinking at a higher level, we're all very well aware of changes in ocean climate, and those are associated with changes in wind patterns. So just a sort of a point to remember as we go forward in time. It's not necessarily going to be the same as looking back in time. My second high-level comment is pertaining to season, and this also was hit fairly clearly in the presentation, but season also is a very critical factor in assessing vulnerability for seabirds to strikes. And this is just because many seabirds in the California current are not year-round residents here. They breed elsewhere all the way across the entire Pacific Ocean basin, and they feed here during certain months of the year. So again, this has already been said, but it's important for reasons that I'll touch on in just a minute. Season is important even for year-round residents in the California current. because when breeding, seabirds are central place foragers. And so their feeding areas are going to be constrained relative to where they might be found during non-breeding areas. When they're non-breeding, they typically disperse more broadly. So both of those factors and the influence of season on what seabirds are here and where they are open up the potential for at least thought in the context of dynamic management of potential vulnerability, dynamic management in both space and time, adjustments about when wind energy platforms, for example, might be allowed to operate. And then my third high-level comment has to do with something that hasn't been touched on, and it's not a strong area of expertise for me too, but I do just want to raise it. And that pertains to the impact of offshore wind energy to seabirds and broader marine systems through indirect effects. My own research with seabirds and marine mammals over decades has shown quite clearly that indirect effects can be huge. And so I want to just raise that point that an example of indirect effects are local and regional influences of these turbines on wind patterns and therefore on upwelling and therefore on the prey base. And I know this is getting way, way out beyond my area of expertise, and I know it has been raised and is continuing to be discussed in the context of offshore wind energy. So I just want to raise that here. And that's all I have to say by way of comment. Again, thanks so much for inviting me to be here.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and really appreciate your comments and review. As the moderator, I'm going to maybe start just with a question for of my own for some of the other presenters, which is maybe just commenting on some of the limitations of the data set. And I'm going to direct this one to Sharon, commenting on the limitations of the data set in terms of what isn't covered. So for example, 44 seabird species were covered, but that's not necessarily all of the birds that might be of interest. And so I think it'd be useful to maybe just say a few words about that, about what was and wasn't covered and why. And in addition, any other just high-level limitations of what we were able to do with the data that were available. So over to you, Sharon.
Sure. Thanks, Arne. Yeah, there were far more species that we had data for than we modeled. And that's in part because if you start to try to model and extrapolate, as Lisa mentioned, observations to where you haven't surveyed and you have very few records, your error is very, very high. So there are definitely a lot of rarer species that we did not include in the model, and some of them are listed species. The Hawaiian petrel, for example, there are observations, but there are very few of them. So we didn't dare extrapolate those few observations to the whole area of our study. So that's definitely one concern, but it's also one that we can address less quantitatively, if you will, because we know that they are dynamic soarers and that they do fly as high as the rotor swept zone. So I think those are things that we have to just take into consideration. And then obviously another thing that we don't have data for, because these are observation-based data, are nighttime observations. So that's where the new technologies and the studies that we're doing, actually under CEC funding, thank you, the Energy Commission, those studies are going to be really valuable to understanding what's happening with these birds at night. And it'll provide us some information that, like I say, we're currently lacking from this model. So to me, those are probably some of the bigger issues. I don't know if Stephanie wants to chime in on her thoughts.
Well, I jotted them down. Yeah, rare species where there's changes in distribution, like Lisa had said. So, boobies, for example, are becoming more northern in their presence. And other species are changing their ranges. Some species are expanding, some are declining. So yeah, there is time issues, but it's hard to predict the future. But it's hard to predict the future from a limited time of data also, because the ocean cycles at such long-term scales of time that it's almost hard. You need a long-term data to understand the ocean. So sometimes short windows of information don't give you the picture you need, and sometimes long ones don't give you the picture you need. And it's striking a balance, like what's the question we're trying to answer? And for this, since facilities operate at decades rather than, we were thinking, trying to get as much information on the historical community as possible. But yeah, it is a gap, that change in distribution through time is ongoing and happening as we speak. And then, yeah, I think that was the main one I thought I would highlight.
And I guess just one other thing that I wanted to note is that, of course, this study was focused on seabirds, and so land-based migratory species and bats were outside the scope of this study. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be studied. They absolutely should be, but that's not what was covered in this study. And I think the data sets that we were working from didn't include information that we could draw from there. I don't know, Sharon, or Stephanie, if you want to comment on that briefly as well.
Yeah, migration pulses are difficult. We do know some birds that might, be flying from California towards Alaska and cut across the ocean. So yeah, there's birds that it's hard for the at-sea surveys to capture migration pulses. By accident, they can. So, if you're out and they saw migrating ducks, for example, they would have put it in the database. But it's just capturing the aspect of migration that's important is knowing, how many birds are moving through. And you really have to target migration to study migration, I think, more than what these broader data sets we have access to that are incredibly valuable for these broad patterns of the core community of seabirds. Yeah, there is gaps when it comes to the fringe elements. So the rare species, rare seabirds, rare other species that are rare in time. Yes.
And I think with that, we'll transition over to some of the audience questions. I think the first one I can respond to is when will, beyond this webinar, when will the analyses be available in a publication-based form? And I guess I'll say two things there. One is that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available. It'll probably take us about a week to clean everything up and make it available, but we will post it along with the presentation slides. In addition to that, the final report associated with the study, as well as some intermediate reports, are nearly ready for publication. I would anticipate that we'll be sharing reports within weeks. And so those will be available reasonably soon, and certainly we would expect within this calendar year. And so we're looking forward to making those available, and we'll post all of those to the Schatz Energy Research Center publications page so that they are freely available for download. I'm going to move over to some other questions. There's a question for Stephanie. What is considered shallow versus deep water for the context of this study?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's two ways to answer that. One is just from a seabird biology perspective. And I think for seabirds, shallow water versus deep water is kind of represented by the shelf break, which is often considered the 200-meter isobath. So that's where the continental shelf is kind of transitions from a more gradual slope to a steeper slope. And what happens there is unique things with the way that the ocean's moving and the way things are interacting to cause nutrient-rich waters to upwell there in a way that it's a productive area of the ocean that attracts seabirds. And anyway, so 200 meters is kind of a cutoff line that we use as seabird biologists often when we're thinking about who's where. But for offshore wind, that's the other important perspective. And for this, right now, the deepest facility is in waters ranging from 260 to 300 meters of water. And it's only one facility. All the other existing facilities are in much, much shallower water. So just from a seabird perspective, most facilities don't exist in a place where we can have these dynamic soars be very abundant, whereas the more you play with the shelf break and further out, the more you start to interact with different types of seabirds than in the shallow water. So anyway, hopefully that answered the question in a way that was clear and comprehensive. Yeah.
Thanks, Stephanie. Maybe I'll pass this one over to Sharon, although it could be Sharon or Stephanie, which is one of the audience members just wanted to have us explain again the difference between collision vulnerability and collision risk, just to make sure that it's fully clear.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that.
Great.
All we're saying about collision vulnerability is that the birds are flying. I think your analogy was pretty good, Arne. The birds are flying in a place where they could collide with the turbine blades, but doesn't mean that they will. It just means they're in that space. They're not even necessarily in the space. They're at the height of the rotating rotor swept zone, the blades. And that is the vulnerability. What they're going to do around those blades or around a wind farm, a wind facility, is uncertain at this point. But the vulnerability at least gets us an early, if you will, first step to understanding which birds are flying and potentially exposed to the rotating turbine blades, if that makes sense.
Thanks. Here's another one, maybe for Stephanie. How representative do we feel that our results for Crescent City will be for Brookings and or Coos Bay in terms of where those wind areas are? And I guess just noting that we didn't show those wind areas on the map, but we did have results for that part of the coast. So I don't know, Stephanie, if you want to provide additional comments there.
Yeah, well, I think that's great. I think we were focusing on California for purposes of this, but we did include much broader observations, especially to the north of our focus area, because and like Arne said, our predictions do include these areas. So they do represent these areas because they literally include them. So I think that, and the Brookings area is very close to Crescent City, where we have a good core of our data. But I would think, in terms of the ocean too, like Point Conception in south is a lot different than Point Conception in north. And then things north of Cape Mendocino are more similar. So things in Crescent City are going to be similar to Brookings. So that's why we decided to include data from Oregon, is that biologically seabirds don't really recognize the boundary. And so having them in helped us improve our California estimates, but it also helps us understand what's going on in Oregon. So yeah.
Thank you. Here's one, maybe I'll see if Sharon, if you want to take this one, which is while I understand that bats were not in scope for this project, would it be possible to use the model developed for this project for assessing collision vulnerability and or risk for bats? Are there different considerations or inputs required for collision risk modeling for bats versus seabirds?
The collision risk model for bats would be very similar to what you would do for seabirds, for any bird, birds and bats. But I think our problem for bats off California is that we have such limited data. It goes back to we can't extrapolate where bats might be because we only have a handful of observations, and it doesn't make any sense to extrapolate where they might be. We just need more basic information on bat use of offshore waters. So I think, ultimately a model could be developed, but again, it's really, we just are lacking a lot of data. Some of the data we have are some boat observations, but mostly how bats do turn up at some of the offshore islands. And again, there are data on those islands, about those islands, but how they're going to react or be in open waters around wind turbines we don't know. So.
Thank you, Sharon. And I see that David Ainley has a hand up. David's part of our study team and is here backstage. David, if you want to just first briefly introduce yourself, since you weren't one of the presenters, so the audience will know who you are, and then please jump in with your response as well.
Yeah, I don't know, seabird biologist. I've probably spent a couple of years of my life at sea studying or collecting data on seabirds, and was actually the originator of also not just collecting information on the number of seabirds, but what height they're flying. And so that information has been important to this analysis. And I have done ocean cruises survey for seabirds and lots in the California current, and also the eastern tropical Pacific and in the Southern Ocean. But anyway, in regard to bats, they do have significant interactions with wind turbines on land. But this is because of the backdraft of these turbines collect insects, and the bats are attracted to these insects. It would be truly amazing if this sort of phenomenon occurred 20 miles off the coast, because first you need insects, and there just aren't that many insects out there. I know I spent 20 years on the Farallones, where there is an invasion of hoary bats every fall. But why hoary bats get to the Farallones is anybody's guess. They're on their way somewhere. But again, it's offshore. You're not going to have all these insects congregating in the backdraft of turbines. So it's a pretty different situation of the bat question of land turbines versus turbines 20 miles off the coast.
Thanks so much. That's really interesting. Maybe moving over to another question. This maybe is a question for Eli and maybe partially me as well. So this is a comment about the Pareto analysis. One of the commenters indicated that maybe the energy generation should be weighted higher than the bird density, suggesting that if we don't keep below 2 degrees Celsius or less, hundreds of bird species will actually reach extinction. And so maybe Eli, if you want to just comment, we didn't actually have, we didn't weight in any formal way. And so if you want to just comment on that, and I can follow up.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of using this Pareto optimization approach, is that we're able to kind of present the shape of the solution space and understand what type of what type of trade-offs are available in our study area without applying these weights. So I certainly resonate with this idea that we need to reduce global warming in order to prevent die-off of species, and kind of agree with this, with the question asker. But it's a bit external to our project to try and think about these really long-term impacts. As Stephanie spoke to, we're looking at kind of a 10, 20-year time scale that's consistent with the expected life cycle of some of these wind facilities.
Yeah. And I think we definitely, in the context of the study, did not want to be in the position of trying to make a judgment about how these different parameters should be weighted. And so we're wanting to present the model and the framework and the analysis that we did, but it's just really difficult to reach a conclusion about exactly how that weighting, if you were trying to do the weighting, how the weighting should be done. So I would say that we deliberately didn't try and introduce weights because we felt that was beyond the scope of what we would be trying to do. Let's see. Maybe moving over to another question for Sharon. One of the comments that came in was that macro avoidance of facilities is good for reducing collision vulnerability and risk, but may be bad for the increase of habitat loss, which may be detrimental for species already facing other stressors with declining populations. Would you comment on that?
Sure. So a couple things. One, we don't really know how the birds are going to respond to offshore wind facilities. So, they may still forage around or in them. We don't know that yet. There's also some other interactions at the facilities, the physical structure and the change in wind dynamics can affect productivity. Also, that their structure in the water attracts colonizing organisms and fish and things like that. So there's a lot of kind of more trophic level interactions that we don't have a really good sense about. But also thinking about the birds that we were talking about that are further offshore, probably displacement is a bigger issue for birds that are nesting and feeding young, that have to go out and forage and bring back food for their young or are nesting in their colonies. And so those birds, if they can't do their foraging trips in a timely manner, is more of an impact. And those are near shore, relatively speaking, compared to where these offshore facilities are going to be. The birds that we were talking about that nest in the southern hemisphere and far away, the ones that fly as high as the rotor swept zone, shearwaters, albatrosses, etc. Remember, they're traveling it's a scale issue, vast distances. They have very efficient flight. So putting a facility, even if it is a fair number of turbines and it seems like a big area to us, that's a small area relative to the foraging dynamics that these species have. So I'm not saying it's displacement is not probably as big an issue for some of the species that we're concerned about relative to collision. I guess that's my answer to that.
Thanks very much. And maybe over to another question, which maybe all of the presenters might have something to say about this, but what do folks think about the biggest knowledge gap? Excuse me. What do folks think the biggest knowledge gap is for better understanding of seabird interactions with wind power structures in a offshore wind West Coast setting? Has anyone begun to consider cumulative effects, like if the turbines create feeding opportunities like fish attracting devices, and how all of those sorts of interactions will occur? Maybe starting with Sharon and Stephanie, if you want to respond to that.
That's a pretty big question. Yeah, there definitely, there's something in Europe that's being studied closely, is that sort of trophic level, again, interactions with turbines and wind farms. I think we're starting to look at that in a sense using a lot of modeling, but until we actually have structure in the water, it's a little hard to say what's going to happen. But yeah, there definitely, people are thinking about it, and I believe there is a project that maybe the CEC is funding or DOE, I forget, to actually look at the first steps. Like say, we know the physical, sort of some of the physical ramifications, the structure, the change in wind, the wind shear, wind velocity, wind wakes, potential effects on upwelling, depending on scale and cumulative number of facilities and how they're located relative to one another. So all those things have to be basically taken from the physical to the what's the effect on the nutrients and biological. And we're just starting to really scratch that surface, I think, at this point, but it's definitely being looked at.
Thanks so much. And of course, I guess one follow-up to that, which is that certain kinds of interactions will be hard to understand fully before there are at least some turbines in the water, and other types of things we might be able to get a good idea from modeling. But there's only so much that can be understood without being able to actually observe interactions. Maybe we do one more question before closing out. And this maybe is a question for both Eli and Stephanie, which is, in the study, was the directional push of wind shear included? And if so, what might be the implications of thinking about the directional push of wind shear?
I can start and then Eli can take over. I think there's different components of the model. So it's wind direction was included to some degree when we were talking about seabird observations, and when you're doing an at-sea survey, when you're traveling with the boat, if the birds are moving with you, you can double count them. So there's flux calculations that are standardized and have publications that incorporate wind direction and speed, speed of travel, things to try to account for this flux and possible double counting, which our math did account for. But in terms of wind speed and seabird flight height, it was just wind speed. So not anything else with wind. We do have information about wind direction, but it's direction relative to the bird. So then every bird you need a direction versus just wind speed, which can apply to the whole area. But yeah, Eli, I don't know if you have anything to add or if I covered it.
I think you covered it pretty well. I think your last comment there really speaks to where my mind goes for this question, which is this model is pretty, it's driven by averages. It's not very temporally resolved. And yeah, like Stephanie said, we would just need to have, flight direction of the bird and other variables that just don't fit well into this model framework as it is long-term averages.
And I think with that, I'll move to close since we're coming up on the hour. I really want to give a huge thanks to all of today's presenters and panelists, as well as everyone in the audience who joined here today. Also, a huge thank you to the backstage team, Maya Kelly and Jessica Cumming, in particular for doing the production work on this webinar and helping to make it possible. As we had mentioned earlier, we expect final reports to be published over the coming weeks to within a month or two. So certainly within this calendar year, we're in the process of responding to final comments there, and just need to go through the final stages of revision before those things are ready for publication. And we'll get them out as soon as they're available, and we'll post them so that they are freely available for download. If you have questions about this research, please contact us at our Wind Studies email account, which is windstudies@schatzcenter.org, or at HD Harvey and Associates email address, which is ecoinfo@harveyecology.com, and we'll share both of those addresses in the chat. If you're interested in receiving updates from the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium on upcoming events, including additional webinars in this series, please email us at info@powc.us. And again, we'll drop that into the chat. I think there was also a question that came up in the session about where to find the data, some of the underlying data and bird density estimates. And we'll share information in the chat about that. Those data can be available on request. With that, I'll just close with a few comments, which circling back to the support for this project from the California Energy Commission. A big thank you to the California Energy Commission for supporting this work, and a big thank you to everyone who joined this webinar today. Thank you all for your interest. And with that, we'll close out and look forward to the next webinar session.